everyone. I hope you had a great week. Today's lecture, we're going to be looking at how we can use rubrics for some of the subjective items that we talked about in the last video, and how using rubrics can help students start to self-regulate their own learning. And in that way, feedback can be sustained within the learner for a longer period of time. So let's start the lesson now. So the next thing we're going to talk about is rubrics and kind of how to create rubrics and the pros and cons of rubrics and sort of what to watch out for. Rubrics are just a criterion reference rules for assisting students' work, and they can either be looking at the performance holistically or analytically as different dimensions. And what it does is we're basically in advance laying out specific expectations that we're looking for in student work and trying to find a way to standardize the review of work that can be considered subjective. When looking at rubrics, there's different types of things to kind of notice. First of all rubrics contain assessment criteria, and usually the assessment criteria is what you'll see in rows. For example, it might be writing mechanics, grammar, topic structure, and then it will also have quality levels that you typically see in the columns. They can be levels of anything from 2 or more. Rubrics also may contain descriptors, kind of describing what happens at each one of the intersections of the assessment criteria and the quality level. Another thing that you want to think about when creating your rubrics is really paying attention to the qualities of the domains and the values, and then also not assuming that when you create a rubric that it's going to be perfect on the first time. You want to make sure that you give them time to maybe stabilize a little bit, and one way you can kind of do that is perhaps by piloting them or working with them collaboratively with your peers and piloting them in more than one class. There's different kinds of rubrics, and they can kind of be broken down into 4 major groups: checklists, rating scales, and then as far as descriptive rating scales, you'll find one that's like holistic, or you can find some that are analytic. The first one we're going to talk about is checklists. And you'll see checklists actually used quite a bit in elementary school assessment, but they can be used for a variety of different ways in middle school, high school. I've seen them used really well, especially like science classes. So for example, while this is something about daily behaviors, like 1, if the student is ready to start class, 2, if the work is ready to turn in, etc., maybe using something like this in a science class where 1, the student is wearing appropriate safety gear, 2, they have written their pre-lab, 3, they have successfully, they have cleaned and put away their glassware, and 4, they have disposed of the reagents in the appropriate jar. That's a little bit more high levels because the work is more difficult, but it still is just as important. So if this was something that you wanted to use as far as like maybe trying to qualify or quantify a participation grade or part of a lab grade, this is a nice way to be able to do something like that. Another type of rating scale might just be something that you're looking at as far as a sort of a continuum that can help assess things like frequency or accuracy or completeness. In this particular example, they have used it to do some sort of like self-reflection on trying to instill self-regulatory behaviors in the student, but you can do this for a variety of different topics, especially if you're trying to sort of maybe gauge motivation, the usefulness of the work to the students. Might be something to kind of look into more detail. I don't usually use rating scales very much. I don't find them as pragmatic for my work, whereas checklists and analytic rubrics I use quite often. The holistic rubric is assessment criteria expressed as like a unidimensional score. So like many things are summed up with one score, and no one component of a performance is expressed specifically. So in this example, what they've done is they've just sort of like categorized the presentation into different levels instead of categorizing each component of the presentation into different levels. So for this one, a score of 5, the presentation is highly engaging to the audience, but perhaps the verbal delivery wasn't very good, so they're going to drop it down to a 4. So they're not going to assess a student on the engagement of the audience, and then in a different dimension, the verbal delivery, and then in a different dimension, the presentation style, or how rich and informative the content was. They're kind of giving them sort of an all or nothing, very brief, holistic score for that. This might be something nice to do if you have sort of short presentations. So for language teachers, if you're going to have a student just give something very short, 2 to 3 minute presentation where you just kind of want to give them an overall score and you don't want to assess them on many dimensions, this might be kind of nice to use. The one that you've probably seen the most often, the most familiar with, is analytic rubrics. And analytic rubrics are meant to assess various dimensions of the work. They can be expressed with performance level as multiple scores, and those scores can be weighted, summed, averaged. When you're doing so, basically, you want to take two things into consideration. First, you want to take into consideration how the rubric is intended to be used if it was given to you by another party. So, for example, if you have been given a rubric to use for standardized assessments, and they're supposed to be averaged or weighted in a certain way, then of course you should follow those guidelines. Now, if you're using an analytic rubric for your own purposes in your own classroom, then you might want to think about what quantitative score best describes the level of work you're seeing from the students, and how that quantitative score can be arrived to by your various quality descriptors for the various dimensions. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. Another thing that an analytic rubric does is that it gives students more focused feedbacks so that they can understand exactly what they did correctly and what they did incorrectly, and they can move to the next level. So here's an example of an analytic rubric that I created. If you notice across the rows, you'll see that the first row is really looking to see how well the students worked on an introduction. The green row is looking at how well they managed to address the hypothesis and assumption testing components. The other test preparations are in that bright blue at the bottom. And each column has different levels that the students can attain. From going from left to right, the levels increase. And if you notice that the points that I have delegated, I have not appointed them evenly. Anybody that gets a score within the first column would not get any points towards their overall score. Anybody who got points in the second columns would get 25 points towards their overall score. Third column is 70 points, fourth level is 90 points, and then the very highest level is 100 points. And I'm going to go over how I've decided to apply the scales in a second. Just to touch on it very briefly, what I'm attempting to do by applying these points is to create variability amongst the scores. So when you're constructing your own rubric, basically you want to take 4 important steps into consideration. The first step is reflection. So when you are reflecting on what needs to go into your rubric, you want to kind of go back and look at the rationale and how you spent time in your class, and decide, why did you decide to create this assignment? Why is it that you've done some sort of essay or report? Generally, it's something that takes a lot of time that requires the students to also engage with the rubric, and you have time in order to use the rubric to give them feedback. Have you given similar assignments like this before? If not, do you intend to do so in the future? Can you create a rubric that can be turnkeyed not just for this long-term assignment, but perhaps for others? The more experience the students have with the same type of rubric or a similar rubric, the more they can start to understand how they can move up the scale. Looking at the other things that are important in the reflection component is, have they received all the instruction that they need in order for them to be able to complete this assignment successfully? What does exemplary work look like? Are you going to share something like that with your class? What does the worst product look like? What would the worst case scenario look like? Are students going to have time to produce this type of work so that they could work towards an exemplary product? Will they have time to work with the rubric if you so chose? So in looking at the example that I'm going to share with you, I created the rubric, the 3 dimensions, as part of a larger rubric for an end of semester performance task. I wanted the students to do a real life statistical report because I wanted to measure their application of a variety of skills, many skills, in a real world context. And in addition, I also wanted to measure their conceptual understanding of the statistical process and evaluate their ability to read, research, do statistical calculations, interpret it, make them meaningful for someone else. Okay, so there's a lot of things that I wanted to assess with this one project. It wasn't one thing. If I wanted to just to see if they could do calculations, perhaps multiple choice might have been better selection for me. Or did I also want to make like a short answer or something like that? Might have been a little bit better than this huge project. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to start listing a ton of objectives. What are the objectives that I want to measure with this? And again, for something like this, for a performance assessment, for anything that's going to be involved to the point where you're going to create a multidimensional analytic rubric for, you want a lot of objectives that you want to measure. My objectives, and they kind of go for a couple different pages here. I think I had 13 total. If you count these up, they come out to be like 13 total. It was looking at all of the class, being able to take raw data, clean it, check for normality, make decisions about what kind of testing preparations were going to be needed or what kind of tests were going to need to be done, trying to look for some degree of accuracy, minimizing error, citing references, writing. There's a ton of stuff involved. For something like this, I just want to start listing how many objectives do I have? Is it worth it to do? Am I getting enough information from what I'm having the students do that it's actually worth it? The next thing I started to do was group and label things. So instead of having 13 dimensions for each one of the skills that I had identified as being important, I grouped them together into 6 or 7 areas. What I did is I took all these different objectives and I started grouping them together. So like, for example, I kept the research component all by itself. So that's why it's in yellow. And then I decided to combine writing the null and alternate hypothesis and reviewing the data for data quality, running assumptions. I grouped that together. I put all the missingness and all that kind of stuff in another section. What I tried to do is try to group as many of those things together so that I could narrow it down and wouldn't have 13 dimensions on my final rubric. So then these were the 7 that I finally ended up with. One for introduction, another dimension or row for hypothesis and assumption testing, etc. Finally, I decided to apply scales. And if you notice on my example, I had levels 1 through 5, and then I had assigned point values according to how I was going to attribute points for each one of those intersections. And then I added them up together and created a percentage. You can do this in any of these particular ways. It's completely up to you. You might also want to see what your school has in mind. Do they like to use, they used to have like approaching or exemplary, proficient. They have a lot of different things that they can use. Another thing you want to kind of keep in mind is, how do you want your rubric to read? Do you want it to read low to high, which is my personal preference? I don't know, I guess as a math teacher, I just think of the numbers getting higher as I go to the right. Or do I want the numbers to go from high to low? The idea of rubrics going from high to low is you want to start off with like looking at exemplary work, and is the student's work exemplary? If so, they can stop. If not, drop down to the next one. It's your personal preference. I can't use a high to low rubric. I make too many mistakes. I guess I've been using low to high for too many years. If you're writing your own descriptions, what you want to do is you want to start with the exemplary description first, and then write the lowest level next, so the worst case scenario, then the center, and then work the other 2 if you want to have 5. So you want to kind of best, worst, and how are things going to fall in between. And then you want to finally decide, like I said, on the quantitative scores for summative purposes. Going back to the way that I attribute points to a rubric, what I try to do is I try to have their scores on the rubric match what I would consider that they would have earned in real life. So if a student is kind of falling in that level 3 and they're just sort of doing average, I feel that 70 is that number that is associated with average work, like a C level. If students are getting a mix of level 3 and level 4, they get, like, for example, 2 70s and a 90, that's going to be somewhere in like the mid to high 70s as a percentage, which kind of makes sense, right? If they had 2 90s and a 70, then they're going to be somewhere in the 80s. So that would make sense. They're not quite to the A- level, they're a little bit less, and that 70 is going to drop them down. What I use for my own rubric's sake, I like to keep the first level at 0 points. If there's no evidence of anything, I feel that the quantitative way to say there is no evidence is 0 points. But this is what I do. You should do what you feel is important. And also you want to make sure that whatever you're doing also aligns with what your school wants you to do. Okay. As you're working with rubrics, try to remember that they're written on paper, not stone. They can take some time to stabilize. There's going to be times where you work with a rubric and you work on it and then you're like, oh no, the student's work isn't perfect, but I don't have anything on my rubric where that I can actually take away points to show them they didn't do something. That's just the way it goes. Don't be hard on yourself. You make a note and you revise the rubric. Or if you feel like it's something that you're seeing over and over and over again, revise your rubric, add another dimension, rewrite another dimension, maybe regroup things differently. There's lots of things you can do. And just because a rubric worked with 1 year, it doesn't necessarily mean that it'll work with the next year. Maybe the next year it works just fine. And maybe 2 years later, you're like, oh no, I forgot to add this or I forgot to add this. It'll be very obvious the things that you want to change. So just change them. The thing you shouldn't do, obviously, is change them midstream. So if you've told the students you're going to be using this rubric to grade their work, then you should use that rubric to grade everything for all the students in the same way. Change it for maybe the next assignment or something. So you just want to be consistent. Use the same rubric for all of your students. Don't change midstream. As far as providing students with rubrics ahead of time, I like to provide it to them ahead of time so they can kind of get an idea of how to use it, what I'm looking for. Nobody likes this shot in the dark type of ideas. You can definitely do that. Some people feel like students should get it when they get their grades. And again, totally up to you. If you would like help creating rubrics, there's lots of things online that can help you. This one right here, Rubistar, is a really great site for teachers. It's free and it helps you create a rubric. You can download it on Excel or Word immediately and start using it. There's thousands for you to choose from, and you can also make your own. Once you start making one, it's really easy to move to the next one. So just kind of keep it in mind. Using rubrics is one way that we can also promote self-regulation feedback. So going back to our cycle here in our conceptual model for classroom assessment, we want the student to try to start to take some of the information that you give them and perform self-checks. And using a rubric to do this, especially if you're using a similar rubric over and over again, is really helpful for this step. So let's talk real quickly about what is feedback. Information about students' performance or understanding, and it can come from a variety of places: teachers, peers, parents, technology. It should follow the teaching, and it could also be seen as new teaching. The reason why we need feedback is because it addresses the student's cognition and the understanding of the content. It lets students decide sort of where they are in the learning. It puts them relative to some goal, how far away they are from attaining some goal, or how far they've progressed since their last feedback cycle. It allows them to understand their own processes and what's been helpful in improving and what has maybe not been helpful. And also it can address students' motivation, because remember, if a student isn't motivated to learn or they don't see the value in what they're doing, it can be difficult to get that buy-in to help them improve. Getting a sense as you give feedback to students and they receive the feedback, it helps the students develop self-control over what they're learning. Since learning, instruction, assessment happens in this cyclical nature, the feedback is meant to improve that cycle. It can also be considered the glue for the processes that are involved in the student being able to self-regulate their learning and classroom assessment. There's lots of studies that suggest that feedback can influence student achievement. When feedback is done effectively and consistently, about 40% of their gains can be attributed to good feedback. I want to quickly discuss types of feedback. So as you're working with your students, you can maybe try to think about what kind of feedback would be the most powerful to give them. So right now, there have been 4 types of feedback that have been identified. The least effective feedback, called self-level feedback, which is FS. A little bit better feedback than self-level feedback is task-level feedback, or FT. Even better than task-level feedback is process-level feedback, which is FP. And the best type of feedback for students is self-regulation level feedback, which is FR. Self-level feedback is actually the most common type of feedback given by teachers to students, and it usually involves some sort of like judgment or personal evaluation on the student. It's usually positive about the learner. So these things might include like good job, you're doing great, gold star, happy face. It directs attention away from the task, and learning cannot be tied directly to the task. So if you wrote a really good topic sentence and the teacher says, great job, you don't really know what it is that the teacher is praising you on. Is it on the whole entire essay? Is it just on the topic sentence? Is it the way you gave details? So it's not focused, and it's really based on luck on whether the student can actually reapply those skills appropriately in the future, because they don't even know what they're getting praised on. What's better than self-level feedback is task-level feedback. And task-level feedback might be things that are good for one particular task. So things like, if you're a math teacher, a lot of times students will, what we call drop negative. Sometime during their process, their mathematical thinking, they will forget to sort of carry a negative number, and their final answer comes completely incorrect. Dropping a negative is something that is not going to be generalizable to other types of subjects, like, I don't know, writing or acting or something like that. It's only good for anything that happens to be working with positive and negative integers or numbers of some sort, or making sure you capitalize proper nouns. That's only good on situations where you're looking at proper nouns. That particular feedback is only good for one particular task at that particular moment. It's different than something, say, process level feedback, where you're teaching strategies to rely on error detection. So maybe instead of saying, don't drop a negative, maybe you can say to students, double check your answer using these techniques. Or you could tell your students, go back and make sure that your capitalization in this paragraph is correct. Always go back and reread the paragraphs and try to detect errors in punctuation, grammar, capitalization. You're basically trying to shape strategies that they can use in future tasks, and even more to shape in future tasks that are not just for your specific domain. The highest level of feedback is self-regulation level feedback. And this is when you're teaching students how to monitor and direct themselves towards a learning goal. What we see is generally less effective learners have lower self-regulation, and highly effective learners have high self-regulation. You might be also able to see symptoms of low self-regulation level feedback when you have students that really need a lot of affirmation in order to know that they're doing something correctly. I've had lots of students in the years of my teaching where they might do a math problem and they'll want me to check it before they go on to the next one. And they want me to check the next one before they go on to the next one. And they're constantly needing my affirmation. Those students aren't having trouble anymore with the actual work. They don't need me to show them how to get better at some sort of calculation. What those students need is for me to help them instill or actually implement strategies that perhaps they've received in the process level feedback area, and self-monitor themselves on how to know when something is correct and how something is not correct. Some feedback can be detrimental. When you're not giving information on how to improve, so like self-regulation feedback, not giving students information about how they can improve, telling them you're so clever, happy face, is not making them a better writer. It's not making them better at doing research. It's not making them a better musician. It's just giving them praise about themselves, and it's not helping them improve. It's distracting from the task. And also, I would say that it's aligned with the growth mindset mentality that we're kind of really trying to be aware of in the classes now, in that it makes a judgment about who they are versus about their work ethic or their persistence. Another thing that can be on the other side is some sort of criticism that might distract from the task. So just like a D-, this doesn't make sense. What part doesn't make sense? If it's something that's so subjective that the students can't really pinpoint how to improve, then looking to see what kind of feedback mechanism can I give them is important. We're going to look at a little bit of feedback here, and we're going to decide which one of these sentences or statements were evaluative, where the teacher was passing judgment on the students or the students' work, or which one of them were descriptive, describing what the student said or did and providing guidance for improvement. So just to give you an orientation for this, performance orientation of evaluative feedback might be great job, good girl. Disapproval might be that's not good enough. It can also be seen as a classroom or individual management. So some sort of reward, happy faces, gold stickers, punishment, losing time with recess, which is sad. Descriptive feedback, as I said, really focuses on the learning outcomes or the objectives and looking to see what things the students maybe did well, what things the students need to improve, and perhaps information on how they can actually get there. So here's some of these statements, and perhaps you could just take a second if you want to pause the video and decide if you know what they might be, what the answers to these might be. If a teacher says something like, try harder next time, is that evaluative or descriptive? If the teacher says you maintained eye contact throughout your entire speech, now you might want to work on your enunciation, is that evaluative or descriptive? You solved the equation, however, you need to include a written or visual explanation. And finally, your writing has definitely improved. So if you want to pause the video and see if you can get these correctly, or otherwise, here are the correct answers. Here is another one. If you want to sort of pause the video for a second and see if you can decide if this would be evaluative or descriptive. Now's a good time to pause. And if you're back, boop, 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 boop. There you go. Pretty simple. Makes sense. In closing, what we want to do is use the feedback in a way so that the feedback can live within the students and the students can make improvement, not just in the short term, but in the long run. And see it as a way that you can close the gap, the learning gap for the students, and it's something that they can walk away with. Again, always keeping an eye on the rationale for the learning and your objectives is really important to this. And having a very clear understanding of what the rationale and your objectives is ahead of time makes you be able to narrow in on the most key components of where students need to learn. If students meet that criteria that you've set, in what ways can you provide additional feedback so they can even surpass the expectation that you had set at the beginning? So I think this is a good time to stop. I've been talking for forever. I apologize if my voice sounds raspy or if this has taken longer than needed. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will see you next Thursday. Bye.